seconds to wait. We must start exactly at 11.
Okay.
You never know.
I hope we don't need to stop exactly at 12 because that's not my strong point.
No, that's okay. So, welcome everyone. Just a short briefing. I guess most of you already know, but to become a docent at the university, you need to go through a number of peer reviews, which Michael has already done. And there's one final formal thing left, and that is actually to have a seminar that he's going to have now. And then after that, he can formally be appointed as Oberbörner Docent, as we call it. And that's all I'm going to say. I think you all know Michael, and if not, I'm sure he'll introduce himself. There you go.
Morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. As Rickard says, this is the docent lecture. I will say I'm still not 100% sure what this is. I don't know what a docent is. For the first 2 years I was here, I referred to it as a docent, so that shows the level of understanding I have here. But nonetheless, I was told to do a seminar, and a seminar is what we're going to do here. And what we're going to talk about is what has been not so much a research interest of mine for the past few years, but basically a research obsession. This has been the thing that has occupied pretty much all of my thinking around research for at least 8 years, and maybe even a little bit before that. And what we're going to talk about today is the inaccessibility of fun, which is basically, the topic here is game accessibility, but the difficulties that come along with trying to make accessibility in game-based environments. We have some people over here on Zoom, and I'm going to apologize to them in advance, and that what you're going to essentially see is me looming over you every time I need to change a slide and then disappearing off into the distance, because I pace a lot. But we are going to start here with some straightforward, simple biographical information, by which I mean almost nothing that's biographical. I tend to refer to myself as the least interesting person in any room, because when people say, well, what do you do for a living? I say, games. What do you do for fun? Games. And it sort of revolves down into this sort of singular kind of focus on this particular topic. And there's not a lot of texture around it. But there are some things that's worth mentioning, as in, why should you listen to me at all about anything that I've got to say about this topic? We're going to talk about accessibility in games in general, but we're also going to narrow down on one specific style of games, and that's going to be tabletop games. Because the search to make accessible games is something that's actually becoming more and more popular in the video game area. But as far as tabletop games are concerned, this is still largely unexplored territory. I've been trying to explore this territory since about 2016, and a lot of that has been done through a website called Meeple Like Us. And Meeple Like Us is where you'll find a number of documented analyses of different kinds of games and the kind of accessibility considerations that they have. This has 220-ish games that have been sort of extensively analyzed from the perspectives of different kinds of accessibility. And that approach that it takes there is something that's been used in a whole bunch of different places. I've successfully pitched this to people at the BBC, the New York Times, and blah, blah, blah. This has become a relatively stable way for people to assess the accessibility of tangible things. Board games are just the use case that I'm most interested in. So this has been something that's been going on for 8-ish years, and it sort of coincided with the growth of the golden age of board games. As in, when we talk about board games here, I don't know what most people are thinking. Well, show of hands here. When I say board games, how many people think Monopoly? That's the first thought that comes to mind. Yeah, a few of you. Scrabble, Risk, the one where you murder everybody in the room. Those are the kind of games that are sort of traditional family-style board games and the ones that people tend to grow up with. But here's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. Board games are actually amazing now. They're actually fantastic. When 2015 or so, I was getting really bored with video games because I was thinking, well, what's coming out this year? FIFA, whatever, you know, the next Call of Duty, blah, blah, blah. And I was asking myself, where's all the creativity in gaming? And it turned out it was all here. The golden age of board games that's suddenly come about in the past 10 or so years has resulted in a massive, phenomenal increase in the complexity and sophistication and fun of board games. If you're thinking as a frame here, Monopoly. Monopoly, I would say, is not a fun game. But a lot of these games that we sort of look at within the site are massively fun. And I should say, if anybody's interested in sort of first-hand experience, we have a games night this evening in Piazza. Feel free to come along and see what these games actually are. But one of the things that I was often asked when I started doing this was, why this as a topic? We've all got one life. Why are you spending such a big proportion of yours on the topic of board game accessibility? And partially that was because people didn't really see that board games were undergoing this golden age. And partially it's because there are lots and lots of real problems in accessibility to solve. People have difficulty accessing the basic functionality of life in different kinds of places. So you have people who are working on the accessibility of transport, the accessibility of the economy, the accessibility of functional software, and all these different kinds of things. Why spend all this time focusing on the accessibility of games? And I'm going to answer that, but first I want to sort of set the context of what we're even talking about here. First thing is, what is accessibility? And here there's a whole bunch of different kinds of schools of thoughts and different kinds of definitions. I'm not going to go too deep into the sort of underlying philosophy of things like what's sometimes called the medical model, which is stand there while we fix you, and the social model, which is we all have responsibility to make sure that society is accessible. What I'm going to give here is a very simple definition of how it gets used in the work that I do. And it's basically an inaccessibility is something that stands between someone and a goal that they want to accomplish. And if you have that sort of wider, more holistic view of what accessibility is, it turns out there's a whole bunch of stuff that we wouldn't necessarily think of as inaccessibilities, but stand between somebody and a goal that they want to accomplish. The work that I do tends to include kind of a broad definition here. So we have things like socioeconomic accessibility, which is something that's becoming more and more part of the conversation. But if you have, for example, an accessibility tool that costs 5,000 crowns, is that really an accessibility tool if the kind of people who need it are maybe on very, very restricted fixed budgets? The socioeconomic factors are a thing that we are becoming more conscious of, but often we provide a whole bunch of solutions to accessibility issues that aren't solutions that will work in the real world. Every so often you'll see in the news a bunch of engineering students who redesigned the wheelchair, essentially. They say, oh, look, press a button, you could actually stand up, and then it'll move you across, and then it'll go up stairs and all these different kinds of things. And then you say, well, how much does that cost to people? And they say, oh, 400, 500,000 crowns. And it's never something that actually ties into any formal Medicaid or equivalent program. So the socioeconomic factor is important, but so are also the emotional factors, particularly when you're dealing with something like a game, right? So I think everybody here's probably played Monopoly. How many of you played Monopoly with a bad loser? Yeah. How many of you played Monopoly with a bad winner? Yeah. So we can think of sort of good winning and bad winning as like the approachable understanding of what an emotional accessibility problem in a game is. And some games are better for this than others. We have a kind of cultural shorthand that people who play chess well are very clever. And you'll see this in all kinds of movies, all kinds of TV shows. President Bartlet in The West Wing in one episode plays multiple games of chess against everybody just to show how smart he is. But the thing is, the ability to play chess doesn't actually necessarily translate into any actual general life skills. Have you ever heard of a guy called Bobby Fischer? Yeah. If you haven't heard of Bobby Fischer, have a look at Bobby Fischer and see what the link between chess and intelligence actually might be. People talk about as well Scrabble. If you're good at Scrabble, you must be good at words. And this is the thing that makes it difficult for people to sort of unpick what's the game and what's the actual skill being used. Because Scrabble isn't a word game. Scrabble's a war game. If you play Scrabble with me, I don't care how verbally dexterous you are, I'm still going to destroy you because I play Scrabble the way that everybody you've ever played Scrabble against and hated. That's the way I play it. All the little two-letter words and sort of blocking people from getting all these different kinds of tiles. Doesn't matter how good you are with words. And in fact, if you are really good with words in Scrabble, the chances are you're going to be completely at a disadvantage by somebody who's just looking to win. But those are sort of the emotional things, as in people sometimes read a lot into victory and successes. And then you have things like how the randomness and such in a game might ameliorate that or cause extra problems. Some people like to be able to say, oh, I lost because the dice went against me. And some people get really angry because the dice went against them. But then we also have the sort of standard everyday ways in which we think about accessibility. Color blindness, blindness in general, physical restrictions. So we have this really, really wide understanding these days of what it means to actually find an inaccessibility in any kind of product. The thing that makes it particularly interesting as a general topic is that all this stuff is intersectional as well. As in, it might be the case that, let's say you have a text-to-speech system. That's fantastic for people who are blind, but text-to-speech systems are more cognitively expensive to process than recorded spoken text. So if you have, for example, a visual accessibility issue and a cognitive accessibility issue, you might just be making the thing worse by using the solution that people think is actually going to be useful. So that's one of the things that makes this a really interesting topic. But the thing is, in games, it's even more complex. And as a result, I think even more interesting. There's some things in a game that you absolutely have to be aware of that you're not nearly so interested in when it comes to everyday kind of software. Show of hands, again, how many of you have a strong opinion on whether or not you click a menu option to print versus a button on a menu bar? Of course you don't, because you're all normal people. But there is a massive difference between pressing a button on a controller and pressing a trigger on a controller. There's a massive difference between using keyboard controls versus using motion controls. Anybody here ever play Rock Band or Guitar Hero? Yeah. So how many of you felt like Jimi Hendrix when you had that plastic guitar in your hands? And how much do you think you would feel like Jimi Hendrix if you were just tapping away on a controller? Within games, the verisimilitude, which is the extent to which things feel real, is a massively important aspect of how we enjoy them. And that means we can't just shift something into a more accessible form. We can't just say, take a button and move it into this easier thing for people to deal with, because something of value gets lost in the way. Fun is incredibly fragile. And because it's incredibly fragile, it doesn't survive much tinkering. I sometimes say to students who are doing games-related projects that they might spend 4 or 5 weeks in playtesting, and all they end up doing is changing a 7 to an 8 in a config file. And that's the thing that changes the thing from being unfun to being fun. That might be how high something jumps, how much health it has, an acceleration curve in a movement, those kind of things. So sometimes there are very, very small parameters within which you can change things. And if you change them too much, things are going to go wrong. The extent to which people feel in control is important. As in, if people feel as if they have autonomy over what their character does, they're not necessarily going to want to lose that in favor of a more accessible solution. Lots of control schemes in video games rely on parallel input. So for example, press down these 2 buttons here and pull this trigger at the same time. The kind of thing, if you ever played an early version like Street Fighter or whatever, the sort of runic, magical thing that you have to do to make the finishing moves happen. Sometimes it involves very complex combinations of things within very tight timing. And you can't just say, well, let's just make it so you press one thing, then another thing, then another thing, because sometimes the windows in which these things have to happen are very, very tight. Making things accessible sometimes also means making things easier. And there's a whole sub-discourse about this in terms of, is it enough or is it something appropriate to make a thing accessible for people with disabilities if it also means the game becomes easier for people without disabilities? And linked into that, there's this whole topic of the stigma that comes along with accessibility. People in general don't want to be seen as needing accessibility support. They want to be seen as just being treated the same as other people. So one of the solutions that a lot of people have to inaccessible games is to make accessible versions of games. So there's things, for example, called audio games, which are literally just sound-based games. And while they're not necessarily just for blind people to enjoy, that's certainly who they're pitched at. But the thing is, if you spend a weekend playing a game and you want to talk to your friends about it, you want to talk to them about Red Dead Redemption, you want to talk to them about Grand Theft Auto, you don't want to talk to them about this niche audio game that nobody else has played. Even with all of this, video game accessibility is actually in a pretty good state these days. Nowadays, if a game is inaccessible, you'll almost certainly find at least one of the major outlets calling it out in a significant article, and then the game becoming accessible as a result. 15 years ago, that wasn't the case. 15 years ago, nobody could have cared less about this topic. But now, it is the case that sort of the growing prominence, as well as the number of people who are actually demanding this as a first order deliverable in a game, has increased to the point that companies can't ignore it. But despite the fact video games are technically more complicated than board games, they're actually easy mode as far as accessibility goes, because we know what it means to play a video game. Now, with some variations, as in there are different peripherals and different kinds of schemes that people can use, this is basically what you're looking at for a video game. There's going to be some kind of video output. There's going to be input via a controller or a keyboard, maybe a motion controller. It might be a VR system, in which case you're going to walk around with a massive scuba headset on all the time. But generally speaking, we know what we're getting with a video game. And because of that, companies like Microsoft can come up with things like this, which is the Microsoft Accessible Controller, which gives you a baseline sort of big button version of the interface, but also a whole bunch of switches at the back that mean if you're using, let's say a sipping wand, or if you're using like a binary controller at the shoulder or whatever, you can plug it in and have it work for particular kinds of controllers. I don't know if anybody wants to, I'll pass around. Here's a prop for people to actually play about with. Because we know the interface of a video game, though, we actually are in a tremendously beneficial, tremendously useful situation for us, which is, as long as we know this is what we're dealing with, the problem becomes tractable. We often talk in interaction design about how constraints improve creativity, and this is basically the constraints of a video game. This interface or something roughly like it. And as long as we know that, we know how to make these games accessible. The fact that games often still aren't accessible, that's a different thing. That's a social problem. But technically speaking, I'm not going to say it's a solved problem, but it's a problem in the process of being solved. But here's the thing. What's the interface of a board game? And that's when it becomes the difficult mode. That's the, hurt me daddy mode, which you would get in something like Doom or Duke Nukem or such. This is the difficulty mode that is designed to cause people pain. Because every single board game has a different interface. And even if they use the same kind of components, they don't necessarily use them in the same kind of ways. So here's 4 relatively straightforward, relatively standard ways in which components get used. Top left, we have a game called Tiny Epic Galaxies. And Tiny Epic Galaxies, you roll some dice. That gives you various kinds of currency you can spend on actions. You do those actions, and that's pretty much it. That's what the dice are for. Randomization. Here we have Race for the Galaxy, which is a game that has like a pile of chits. And those chits, once they're spent up, that's the game over. They're sort of the score that you get, but also the timer for the game. This is a game called Archaeology, the New Expedition. And it's a game where you hold a hand of cards, play cards at a table, pick cards up from a table. That's all you have to do with it. And then we have Catan. Now, I have a complicated relationship with Catan, but nonetheless, Catan is sort of what you might think of as the monopoly of the golden age of board games. As in, if you say to a lot of people, board games, they'll think Monopoly. If you say to a slightly nerdier group of people, board game, Catan is what they'll think of. But Catan is a game that has a bunch of these tiles, which are laid out to create a map. And then these other tiles are put on top of it to give an indication of how good particular parts of the map are. So we have dice, we have counters, we have cards, and we have tiles. The thing is, just because a game has these elements here doesn't mean that we're going to use them in the way that we would expect. So here's 4 different games. The top left, we have a game called Lords of Vegas. And dice in Lords of Vegas, yes, they are used to generate random numbers, but they're also used to indicate ownership. of casinos on a board. So you get a dice, and what we're basically saying here is we have 6 ownership in this casino. Somebody else might put a red die next to it, and then they have whatever ownership in that casino. And when you change the ownership, you change the color of the dice. So the dice aren't necessarily only used for randomization. They're also used for indicating area control. Top right here, we have a game called Tigris and Euphrates. And there it has similar kinds of scoring tiles. But the thing is, the tiles don't work the way you would expect them to work. With Race for the Galaxy, you just pick up tokens and then you say, these are how many points I have. With Tigris and Euphrates, you have the number of points equal to the smallest pile of tokens that you have. So you can have like a massive pile of tokens and still end up with 5 or 6 points. One thing you really need to explain to people when they start playing that that's how it works, because they get very angry otherwise. This is a game called Innovation, which is also a card-based game. But for this one, you don't really hold hands of cards. What you do is you'll lay cards out on the table. And the direction in which you splay those cards, as in when you actually spread them up, left, right, or whatever, determines the number of icons that are available. And those icons are what you can use to unlock particular activities. So it's a hand of cards, but it's not a hand of cards the way you would necessarily use it. And then we have here a game called Hive, which has hexagonal tiles in the same way Catan has. But those tiles are going to move around because that's what moving in Hive is. The spider, for example, can go up on the outside of things. Things can climb over other things. It's a game that sort of evokes a fairly strong visceral disgust response in me, but nonetheless, this is a game that uses tiles in a very different kind of way. So that's a big problem when it comes to board games, that we don't know what an interface of a board game is. But that's not even the real problem. And this is where we come to the topic of this talk here after I don't know how many minutes. How many minutes before we actually talk about the topic? 20 minutes. Not too bad. That's actually faster than normal. The problem here is that inaccessibility, as in preventing people from accomplishing a goal that they want to accomplish, that's actually where fun comes from. There is no fun without inaccessibility. And if that's a fundamental part of what it means to have fun, then we have a difficulty in games in that how do we balance that? How do we deal with the fact that a game needs to be inaccessible while also trying to make for accessible games? Essentially, right at the very heart of this topic is a devil, and that devil is inaccessibility. And we need to be constantly saying, okay, we'll deal with these inaccessibilities, but we have to keep these ones, otherwise we lose the game. I don't know what the game of Scrabble looks like if you don't have to worry about making legal words with it. But I'm fairly sure it's not Scrabble. And I'm also pretty sure it's not going to be fun. I don't know what the game Monopoly looks like without the almost brutal style of dominating other people at the table. As in, you defeat somebody, you take all their resources and you use it to crush the other player at the other side. I don't know what Monopoly feels like without that model of economics in it, but it's not Monopoly. So in order to deal with these kind of inaccessibilities, we have to be aware of what is the part of this thing that needs to be what it is, and what are the parts that we can actually reasonably get rid of. That's what the challenge is here, because having a fully accessible game, a fully accessible board game in particular, is almost impossible. And all the time that I've been looking at games, I've discovered maybe 2 or 3 with some changes I could realistically recommend to everybody. But that's a very, very small proportion of the games that we've looked at. And the vast majority of them tend to be massively inaccessible in one category or another. So as an example of what I mean here, because this is often where people say, I don't really buy this thesis, that inaccessibility is where fun comes from. I always do the same thing, and I shouldn't, because I don't know anything about sports, and yet I'm about to give you a sports metaphor. I apologize in advance for anybody who actually knows how these particular sports work. So, football. Imagine, well, proper football, football as in the thing you kick, a foot, not the one you carry the ball, the one where you kick the ball. But no, that's actually a fair point about a terminological inaccessibility between America and Europe and the UK. as to what football even means, but that's a digression. But imagine what the roots of football could have been. Imagine two cave people back in ancient times got a stone between them. And one says, you know what? I think it'd be fun if I kicked that stone between those two rocks there. Walks up, kicks the stone, goes through the what is actually a goal, but they don't know it's called a goal yet. Kick it through, and they go, yeah, that was all right. Grabs a friend and says, tell you what, you try and stop me from doing that. You stand between those two stones, and when I kick the stone through there, your job is to stop it. Kicks the stone through, zooms through past the other player. Fantastic, that was brilliant. And the other player says, oh, it wasn't. You just kicked a stone at me. I'm not going to catch it. Say, okay, so that wasn't fun for you, but it was fun for me. So the goalkeeper, again, doesn't know he's called a goalkeeper at this point here, says, tell you what, gestures over some of his friends, 10 of them. Say, okay, now here's how it works. You try and get that stone into the goal, and we're all going to try and stop you. Starts again. The guy winds up the shot, goes to kick it. Everybody rushes towards him to stop. A few minutes later, when he regains consciousness, looks up and says, actually, that wasn't fun for me, while everybody else was cheering. So he grabs 10 people. And then the other one says, well, okay, now we're disagreeing about how the rules are. So they bring in a referee. The referee pays attention and gets new powers. And over time, the game becomes something very, very different from just kicking a ball into a goal. The thing is, every single one of those things is an inaccessibility. It's a thing that's there to stop somebody from accomplishing the simple goal. And those preventions, those obstacles are the thing that's making the sport, I'm told, fun. I've never really seen the fun in it myself, but there's enough people who enjoy it that I'm willing to accept there might actually be some. So if you were going to take football and make it a more accessible game, there's lots of ways you can do it. You can make the goal bigger. You can reduce the number of players on the other person's team. You can get rid of the offside rule. I'm fairly sure it doesn't matter, even though people get very excited about it. But all of those things change the challenge, the tenor, the experience, to the point that you're probably not going to have nearly as much fun with it as you otherwise would. Lots of the games that we sort of think of as being part of the general cultural vocabulary of life, chess and all these different kinds of things, evolved over hundreds of years, or at very least dozens and dozens of years, to become what they are. So they sort of evolved to the point at which they're as fun as they can be. And if you change any part of that, it's the whole fragility of fun thing, that we're actually potentially going to break down the fun of what we're dealing with. So what we need to be aware of is, what are the actual genuine inaccessibilities that need to be there in order for the thing to be fun? And what are the inaccessibilities that are basically there by accident? So what we have here as a picture is from a game called Unlock Escape Adventures. And these are basically escape rooms in a box. Some of you who were at one of the previous away days maybe got a chance to play one of these. This is from the, I think it's from the demo of it rather than any one of the particular games. So you probably haven't seen this puzzle. But here, it doesn't come across particularly well in the overhead. But we have an alarm here, and it has a bunch of colored wires coming from it. And then we have a bunch of colored wires coming in here. And what your job is to match up the colored wires that have been cut and twisted to the number that you actually need to calculate to put in to unlock the safe behind this picture. But there's a problem with that. And whether that problem is necessarily there is a matter of philosophy. It's a matter of essentially a game design discussion. But here's the problem. This is the same, essentially the same pad that we had here on the right-hand side, except it's going through a piece of software called Chromatic Vision Simulator. Now, you can just download this for your phone. It's completely free to use, and I found it revelatory in terms of seeing where color blindness issues manifest in real life. So at the top, we have chromatic vision, so people who can see full color. The top right, we have a kind of red-green color blindness called protanopia. Here we have a different kind of red-green color blindness called deuteranopia. And here we have a blue-green color blindness called tritanopia. If you have fully chromatic vision, It's absolutely fine. Kind of. It's not, again, easy to see on the projector. But let's say you have protanopic vision. The red and the brown there are almost impossible to tell apart. And the far color, which I guess is a darker kind of brown, under certain lighting situations, that's not easy to tell apart either. So if you're trying to untangle wires of those colors to map them on to particular numbers, you can't even tell as a protanope whether or not that's what the puzzle is, because you don't get to see that in the same kind of way. You don't get to see, oh, there's 5 different colors, 5 different colored wires, therefore I need to match them up. Similar kind of thing here, but you can also see for all these 3 major categories of color blindness that there is a problem in terms of presenting this particular puzzle. Now, whether or not that's an intentional or an unintentional inaccessibility, or whether it's a necessary inaccessibility, depends on whether you think color should be a part of puzzle design. Because the thing about these games is you buy them and you have no idea what's in them. You open them up and the discovery of the puzzles is part of what the experience of the game is. So they can't give you on the cover of the game, this game has a color challenge, it has a math challenge, it has these different kinds of things here. All they can say is, here's the theme. It's a haunted house. It's a university full of serial killers. It's one of these different kinds of things. They can give you a theme, but they can't break down what the structure of the puzzles is. So if you're going to say, well, we can't use color as a possible language for puzzles, then can you then use visual information at all? Can you use mathematics? Can you use anything that requires any kind of cognitive skill at all? Because in order for a puzzle to be a puzzle, it has to have some kind of challenge to it. And the extent to which you say color is or is not a possible thing for that determines, well, essentially the vocabulary you have for building puzzles. So this is an example of something that could be a necessary inaccessibility, or perhaps with a different design philosophy, not. This is a game called Yamatai, which has no particular significance to any of the colors. Now, I would say, even if you have fully chromatic vision, this is not an easy game state to make out. It's incredibly busy. It has lots of different kinds of pieces, each of which have different meaning. It has a whole bunch of moving parts, as in these little boats and things are going to move around the game. And even if you are able to pick up colors perfectly, you can look at that and say, I have absolutely no idea what's going on. You need to spend quite a lot of time interrogating each part of it. But if you have protanopia, again, top right, that may as well not be a game state at all, because you've got no clear way of differentiating between the reds and the greens. And the reds and the greens are a significant part of what's on the board. Similar thing here, and again, with this different kind of category of color blindness, it's not that the problem changes, it's just the specific way in which that manifests. Why does Yamatai use those colors? Absolutely no good reason. There's no reason at all that it couldn't have been a different set of colors. But you'll find in a lot of board games that red, green, blue, the 3 worst colors that you can have for color blindness, is the default of almost every game that comes with these kind of tokens. Anything that comes with meeples, which are the little human-shaped things, cubes, any of these different kinds of things, red, green, blue is the default. There's no reason it could have been white, black, red, and gray. Those tend to be relatively safe colors as far as color blindness goes, but it's just not what we use. So what we have here is not necessarily an intentional inaccessibility, but an inaccessibility that comes about the fact that people were basically lazy with the color choices. They never sat and thought, well, what difference does this make to a very significant proportion of our player base? This is a game called Tashkalar, and Tashkalar is a pattern matching game. You have a card, which if you can configure your color pieces in the right kind of arrangement, you get a special effect, and that special effect will change the state of the board. It doesn't particularly matter what category of piece you have here, unless it's one of the higher class ones, but we won't worry about that. Let's just say it doesn't matter what kind of piece that you have. So quick question to everybody here. Is this pattern here represented in there? Yeah? Not everybody is nodding or shaking their heads. Yeah. Now, the thing about this game here is that it doesn't matter if it's rotated, it doesn't matter if it's flipped, and as I say, it doesn't matter if you actually specifically match these things. So what you've got here is a visual parsing exercise that's actually pretty complicated. I've actually got it here so that you're right, those of you who nodded, the pattern is actually there, it's in the green tokens. But you have to grind over the whole of this to see, okay, is it in that form? Is it in that form? Is it in a rotated form? And if you have like a very, very busy board, it can be almost impossible to work out if one of these configurations is present. So then, is this an intentional inaccessibility? Is it a thing that has to be there? And in order for this game to be what it is, I think you can realistically say, well, I can't think of an easier way to handle this kind of complexity in a more visually accessible way. But the process of creating this game creates this inaccessibility. Does it have to be there? That's something that we need to decide as a game designer. Yeah.
The test, especially if you are colorblind.
I think it's probably going to be lucky if we get to the end of this on time without including that. But maybe at the end. Right, Terraforming Mars, a tremendously popular game from a Swedish designer. And these tokens here have the property of being logically malleable, which is to say the value that they have to the game depends on which part of the board you put them in. So this big chunk of gold, for example, I think it's 10, 50, 10. Here it's worth 10 money, and over here, and then it's worth 10 iron. So the value it has depends on where it is on the player map. Nothing wrong with that necessarily. The problem is that this player map, you can't really apply the word greasy to paper, but it's basically a greasy player map. As in, all it takes is for somebody to tap a table and then it basically randomizes the whole game state. Things slide into different things. These markers here, which tell you how many things you're supposed to be getting per turn, they'll jump tracks. And there's no real reason why there couldn't have been a more frictive surface for this, other than perhaps cost. You'll find this kind of game here is one where people tend to use 3D printing and additional trays and such to deal with the inaccessibility that's built into the game. But what we can say is there is no reason at all that this has to be the way it is. Plenty of games have solved the issue of having lots and lots of different kinds of currencies without basically making a sneeze a massive equalizer in game state. There's a game called Spyfall. And Spyfall is a game where everybody in a group knows where everybody else is, except for one person. And that one person has to deduce from questions everybody else asks each other, which of these locations that they're in. So let's say we're in a pirate ship. And you might ask a question that is designed to sort of reveal that another person understands you're on a ship without giving away the information to the other players. You might want to say, got lots of booty on that raid of that merchantman the other day. People are going to say, we're on a pirate ship. We know that. So you have to ask more subtle questions like, oh, what do you think of the weather today? And then everybody who's on a ship says, well, that's significant because who cares what the weather's like in a university? None of us see the sun. Who cares what the weather's like in a theater? So knowing the right kind of questions to ask means that you can confirm with other people where they are without leaking information to the spy. The problem is, if you are the spy, you don't get an indication of where you are. Everybody else has a little picture that shows where they are. And the spy has to sort of memorize all of this. Or, and this is the big problem, sort of constantly look at the map of all the locations without anybody else actually noticing what's there. Later versions of Spyfall solved this with the incredibly creative solution of giving everybody their own map. But the early versions of it just gave you this thing. So you either had to memorize this whole thing or try and catch a peek of it. And trying to catch a peek of it was something that people could easily pick up on. So it basically destroyed the structure of the game. Unintentional inaccessibility, as we know, because they fixed it later on. But this kind of problem here is a visual processing problem. It's a cognitive processing problem. It's a whole bunch of things. Arkham Horror, the card game. Those of you who know anything about, let's say, Magic the Gathering or similar kinds of games already know roughly what this game is. You build a deck of cards and you try and use this deck of cards to accomplish a particular goal. This is story-driven in a way that most Magic the Gathering sets aren't. But I would describe this one in its inaccessibilities in a number of ways. One is these instructions are, it's almost like you're trying to deal with a malfunctioning spam bot. It's very, very difficult to understand what it is they actually want you to do. So that's one thing. The actual different kinds of layouts of the cards, another thing. The font's difficult to read. There's often symbols interlaced in the text, which isn't great for visual accessibility. But none of that's the real problem here. For Arkham Horror, the card game, the problem is the business model. And it's a business model which, in my view, is indistinguishable from a mugging. What happens is you buy this game and you get a series of scenarios. You play through those scenarios, and then once you're finished with the scenario, you're supposed to move on to the next part of the story. But this is a horror game, and horror games thrive in the unknown and the unexpected. So when you get to the end of a scenario, what they're basically saying is, well, play them again. Enjoy, try different ways of doing it. But if you know once you open the door, there's a Lovecraftian horror at the other side of it, you're not going to be worried so much the next time. You're going to be thinking, right, okay, so we need to make sure we've got a shotgun, plenty of ammo, we need the magic spells that do these kind of things. You're prepping for things rather than reacting to things. But even that's not the problem. The problem is that you get 3 scenarios in the starting set, and there are 8 scenarios in the story. So in order for you to actually progress through the story, you need to buy a whole bunch of expansions. Buy the main expansion, and you get another 3 of those things. And then you need to buy the other one separately. So it is, narratively speaking, a game that sort of draws you into the story and then forces you to keep buying it just to get the new parts of the story. It's a fantastic game, by the way. It's a really, really well-designed game. But I sent it back because I was unwilling to basically be led on a regular basis to buying new expansions. So those are just some examples of the kind of discussions that we need to have about different kinds of games to say whether or not they're accessible or not. Another 3 quick examples here. First one is Cards Against Humanity. Anybody played Cards Against Humanity? Anybody played it but not willing to admit it? Yeah. Cards Against Humanity is a game that is almost explicitly driven by this idea to be shocking. You know, the original sort of tagline they had, it was an awful game for terrible people. And the idea about it is it's supposed to be transgressive. No, you're supposed to play it and play out these horribly insulting and offensive kind of jokes. The idea being it's sort of like I think the sort of, if you're generous about it, it's kind of like a cultural exorcism, and that you're all sort of making your own worst thoughts and putting it on the table, and then just, you know, they lose their shock value for that. But if you are not willing to opt in to that, playing Cards Against Humanity could be an extremely upsetting proposal for people. And not only that, you don't even need to be playing it for it to be a problem. You just need people to be playing it next to you, and then you could hear what they're saying. But you can't possibly say that's not intentional. That's part of the design of Cards Against Humanity. This 5 Tribes here is massively complex from an information processing perspective, to the point that the rules basically say, don't try and plan out, just react. Just go with what feels right rather than try and strategize it, because it's almost impossible to strategize. But again, intentional. It's in the manual that that's what they're looking for. This one here is a game called Escape: The Curse of the Temple. And this one, you roll dice that allow you to explore this ever-evolving tomb. You try and find treasures, you try and find ways of essentially escaping it, finding the exit and being able to unlock the exit. And you roll 5 dice and they'll tell you get 2 movement points and you get 2 crystals or whatever. And you're doing this to a time limit. So you've got, I think it's about 20 minutes, and about 10 minutes in, there'll be a gong that says, everybody get to the center, and then you've actually got to try and escape. Now, that is an incredibly straightforward, simple game until you add in the gimmick of it, which is everybody rolls the dice at the same time, and everybody rolls the dice as fast as they can roll the dice. So what you've then got is a game where the speed is set by essentially the players at the table. The faster they are at rolling, the faster you need to be at rolling to keep pace with what people are doing. And again, entirely an intentional inaccessibility. But all of this is just to sort of show some examples of how accessibility and inaccessibility can manifest in games. The difficulties, if you identify an inaccessibility, are, well, how do you fix it? And it turns out most of these things are easier to fix than you might think. There's not an awful lot of difficulty in making a game that is colorblind friendly, or even completely 100% colorblind accessible. We know how to do that. The answer is what's called double coding, which is color plus something else, color plus a pattern, color plus a shape, color plus a texture. And if you do that, color blindness is never a problem. It's just a benefit for people who actually don't have color blindness. Making games that are more emotionally accessible isn't necessarily all that difficult. And a big part of the work that I've been doing over the past few years has been to map out what are the ways in which these things can actually happen. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to any solutions. We're just going to talk about problems today. But it's not as difficult as people think to make these kind of accessible games. Now, one of the question I asked right from the very start of this is, we get one life, why invest mine so much in doing this? And it comes to this idea of the games matter. You know, it's been a long time coming. I used to have students who wanted to do, back in earlier universities, they wanted to do games-related projects for their masters and their bachelors. And they always used to say to me as if they were confessing some kind of dark secret. I was thinking about doing a game for my bachelor's project. Can I do that? And the answer is always, yes, of course you can. You know, don't feel as if you have to be diminishing what you want to do. Games are as valid of academic inquiry as anything else. But they still have, in a lot of cases, this veneer of being frivolous. So the last thing that I try and do when I communicate this to people is trying to convince them that A, this is worth doing for its own sake, and B, we all have a shared interest in this particular topic. Almost all of us, I would imagine, have some good memories about games. And those who played Monopoly, maybe they weren't terrible memories. Maybe they were memories that were good because of the people as opposed to the game. But almost all of us have positive experiences with playing cards with friends, playing, you know, having grandparents teach you games from their past, playing, you know, fun games with your friends at university or whatever. But that's not the same thing as it being an important topic. You know, it's not the same thing to say we see value in it, therefore it has an import. You know, there's plenty of things where that's not the case. So the question then becomes, do games actually matter in the great scheme of things? Is this a valid thing for somebody to spend a huge amount of time actually studying? And it sort of depends on the frame that we have for this, because if games don't matter, probably doesn't matter if they're inaccessible. You know, there are lots of massive popular things that nobody cares if they're accessible because they're just not deemed to be particularly important. But the thing about games is, games are increasingly becoming understood to be a major product of our culture. You know, the gaming industry, not the tabletop gaming industry, but the gaming industry itself is phenomenally massive. It's bigger than the movie industry plus the music industry combined. Doesn't have anything approaching the sort of cultural credibility of either of those. But as a business, this is absolutely massive. There are problems that come with that, you know, as in the costs of development versus the revenues that come in, blah, blah, blah. But nonetheless, this is a massive business. And in order to diminish it by just saying, well, it doesn't really matter because it's frivolous. Is music frivolous? Are movies frivolous? Sometimes I have students in courses who want to say, I want to do a thesis on a particular game. And the thing I've always said to them is, well, if you were a literature scholar, nobody would blink an eye if you want to do your thesis on Moby Dick. You know, it would just be part of the understood vocabulary of what your discipline involves. I believe games are in that same light, as in students who are games need to play games the same way literature students read books. These are the primary texts of an incredibly large and growing sector. And not only that, games are now one of the default ways in which people engage with each other. And sometimes these people are younger people, but you can see, for example, the impact of Fortnite on Minecraft and similar kinds of things, and the way in which kids are creative, the way they talk to each other, the way they relate to each other. There is a darker side to that, of course. If something is important, people will attach value to your participation in it. And you'll find, for example, kids being bullied for not having, premium skins in particular games. If they just have the default, what everybody has, it's kind of the equivalent of going to school in old secondhand trainers for a lot of kids. But that wouldn't be the case unless people ascribe some kind of value to the participation in these kind of products. And that comes to sort of the reason why I think this is an interesting and worthwhile thing to do. And it's because games are products of culture, and culture matters because people matter. And if any kind of culture is sufficiently dominant for it to be something that people talk about on a regular basis amongst themselves, denying people the ability to be part of that conversation is a problem. We make television shows accessible with closed captioning and narration, all these different kinds of things, because we understand people want to be able to talk about TV shows with their friends. Games are lagging considerably behind that. But still, you've just played the newest release. Let me tell you, when Grand Theft Auto 6 comes out, you will not be able to escape it. It will be everywhere. It'll be on billboards, it'll be on buses, it'll be on TV shows. And if you're not able to play Grand Theft Auto and all your friends are talking about it, what's basically happening there is you are excluded from a very significant part of cultural conversation. But even that's not the big problem, because if you're just excluded from talking about what other people do, that's bad, but it's not that bad. The problem for us, as people who are sort of looking to make these things accessible, is that there are particular touchstones in this hobby that are a shorthand for the kind of things that people aren't paying a huge amount of attention to. Monopoly is the shorthand for sort of all family board games. There's a fair chance, even if you're not a hobbyist board gamer, that you will have heard of the game Wingspan. Anybody heard of the game Wingspan? Yeah. Pauline and I have a friend back in Scotland who is a massive Twitcher. He's a bird watcher. And for the first time ever, he recommended that we play the game together. And he recommended we play the game Wingspan because he'd heard of it. It was something that he'd heard about despite having no interest in games. We should say when we played it, at the end of the 4-ish hours it took to get to the end of it, he did look like he had just escaped from a CIA internment camp. He was sweating and hair everywhere because it was considerably a heavier experience than he thought it was going to be. But nonetheless, Wingspan has achieved a kind of cultural awareness around it that most games don't have. And now you can walk into any bookshop and buy Dungeons and Dragons. And I find that baffling because my experience when the first time I ever bought a role-playing game, and I swear there's no word of exaggeration here, you had to go down an alleyway that a guy told you about. Just, yeah, I know a place. You know the alleyway there? Go down that alleyway. Go about halfway down and take a turn. Go down the other alleyway. You go into this dark, dingy shop. There's a guy standing there. He looks like he's never had a customer in his life. He stares at you and you say, "You see what you've got in the back?" And he goes and takes you into the back where there's a bunch of cardboard boxes where you could buy a copy of Dungeons and Dragons. That's no longer the case. Dungeons and Dragons now is a cultural property that almost everybody has at least some familiarity with. But back in the day, there was nothing less fashionable you could be than somebody who was into Dungeons and Dragons. So as these become larger, more significant parts of what we understand society to be, it becomes more and more important that diverse viewpoints are given a chance to feed in on this. We don't just consume culture, we create culture. We create the discussion around culture. Nobody is a passive participant in consuming culture. How many of you had massively strong opinions on the last episode of Game of Thrones? Yeah. And how many of you expressed those opinions at length to your friends? Of course you did, because that's what culture is. It's inherently participative. And if people can't participate in this particular part of it, then we are doing a disservice to this discipline. If games are to be part of the cultural conversation, we need to give them exactly the same kind of credence that we give to other forms of entertainment. Now, that's why it matters to people who have disabilities or people who are excluded from these kind of things. The other thing is, well, why does it matter to us as people who, I assume, I'm not going to inquire or anything, but I assume a group of people who are relatively abled? Why should we care about it? And what I sometimes say is that I'm kind of looking forward to when the bombs fall, because then I'll have time to actually do all the stuff that I haven't been able to do so far. I'm envisioning kind of a very positive apocalypse, as in all the bombs fall, but my house is left completely unscathed and there's power and water and all these different kinds of things. Maybe in a softer sense, when or if I retire, I would like to be able to play all the games that I don't have time to play right now. My shelves are absolutely full of games that I bought that have never come out of the shrink wrap because I've just never had the time for it. Sometimes I pick up a game and say, well, what's the playtime of this? 4 hours? Yeah, no chance. I'm not going to draw together a bunch of people for 4 hours to play this game. The older you get, the harder it is just to get people in a room to play these kind of things. Anybody who's tried to arrange a Dungeons and Dragons campaign on the regular will have that experience, which is all it takes is one person saying, yeah, I can't, I've got to take the kids to whatever. And you say, well, we'll push it back a week. And that becomes 2 weeks. And that becomes, well, we'll pick up when people have got more time. A lot of this work that I do here is selfish. Partially is to do with the fact that this is a fascinating puzzle. How do you make tabletop games accessible? But also, I want them to be accessible when I'm older. And when I'm older, and when we're all older, we accumulate a whole bunch of things that we might not necessarily think of as disabilities, but certainly manifest as similar kinds of things. My PhD supervisor had a tremendously insightful thing that he used to say, which makes sense in an academic context, but doesn't make sense when you try and say it to normal people. Basically this, extraordinary people, by which he mostly meant people with disabilities, in ordinary circumstances, have many of the same needs as ordinary people, as in people who don't have disabilities, in extraordinary circumstances. Now, the sort of drawing that down to its simplest kind of fundamentals, it kind of means if you have Parkinson's, the accessibility support that works for Parkinson's also works for somebody who is on a juddery bus. You know, the kind of approaches that you take are very, very compatible. And on the basis of this, this is the way in which I've been trying to sell this to organizations over the years. Because I would love it. I would absolutely love it if people cared about this because it's the right thing to care about. But there's 50 or 60 right things to care about, and the exact priority everybody gives to different parts of it, that's going to vary from person to person. So I call this the grid of enlightened self-interest, which is along the top, we have different kinds of categories of inaccessibility, of the kind that we speak about on the side. And along the left-hand side, we have where these are likely to manifest. So permanent impairment is what we generally think of in terms of disability. That this is something that's always going to be a factor. It's probably never going to get significantly better, although it might be corrective to an extent with supporting tools. Temporary are the things that happen to us, and they're always going to be a factor for a short period of time. After that period of time has been and gone, they're no longer a factor. And then we have the situational ones, which are, they might be a factor or they might not, depending on the specific configuration of what's happening around us. I sometimes refer to myself as the communication situational impairment in any conversation, because in a lot of cases, people are not talking to me in their first language. And being a Scottish man, not necessarily the easiest accent in the world to understand. So there is an additional cognitive cost that people have talking to me if they are part of a multi-language group. People can talk to each other in Swedish or whatever, then they talk to me and they have to translate, maybe don't necessarily know exactly the word they mean to use, and it's more time-consuming and cumbersome for them. So here, with a group of mixed language friends, a situational communication impairment, because not everybody is being able to talk to these things in the thing that is simplest to them as a format. They have to add in this additional cognitive cost. But you can see here that in every combination of impairment and severity, that there is something that affects particular people in that group. One of the cool things about Sweden is that you have things like BankID and Swish. It's awesome, right up until the point that BankID or Swish fail, at which point you may as well be going around like a homeless person. You have no ability to pay for things. How many of you have cash on you right at the moment? Right, make a note of that. We'll get them at the end. But most of us don't have cash on us, because why would we? You go into a lot of shops and they say, oh, no, we don't even know what we're doing with that. When I first started here and I didn't have like a proper bank account registered, I got paid in sheafs of certificates and I had no idea what to do with them. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll go to the bank and get it changed into money. And the bank said, well, we don't change things into money here. We don't have that kind of money on hand. And when I say they don't have that kind of money on hand, what they mean is a monthly salary payment. They could not make that in terms of the money they have. So if you don't have access to the infrastructure of Sweden, Sweden is an incredibly hostile place to try and live. If you do have access, it's fantastic. It's super convenient. You know, you just walk on a bus and show a thing. That's all you have to do. But if you don't have it, then you are basically massively socioeconomically disadvantaged. Hopefully on a temporary basis, maybe on a situational basis, but depending on how things go, perhaps on a permanent basis. So all of this stuff is relevant to us because we all experience these kind of inaccessibilities in different kinds of circumstances. I have varifocal glasses, and the first time I wore them and tried to give a lecture, it was honestly like trying to give it on the deck of a swaying sailing ship. Because if you're not used to it, you look down and you get this touch of vertigo, and you look back up and you get a different touch of vertigo heading the different direction. And that, again, a situational or temporary impairment in my vision. So we all have these kind of things. So the reason why we should be caring about inaccessibility is not just because it's good for other people, but because it's also good for us. So to conclude, this is, as far as I'm concerned, the single most interesting problem domain in interaction design, I would say, but particularly when it comes to those of us who are interested in accessibility. There is no end to the number of different puzzles you need to solve. Every time a new game comes out, there's a new puzzle to solve. There's a game called Kitchen Rush that uses egg timers. Well, that's cool. I mean, that's an interface consideration that you don't see in many kind of games. There's a game called Parfumé, which uses scratch and sniff cards, and you use that to mix perfumes. Again, super cool, but I've never looked at any game like that. There's no end to how complex and interesting these things happen. But also because we're part of this growing golden age of tabletop games, this is becoming increasingly impactful as time goes by. 10 years ago, or even just 8 years ago when I started, nobody could have cared less about this as a topic. I started looking at this because nobody else was looking at it. And I mean, literally nobody else. And over the years, that's changed. There's now a fairly vibrant, small niche of people who are actually looking at this on an ongoing basis. But we are still very much at the start of this journey in sort of creating accessible games rather than the end of it. We don't have any answers. What we do have are sort of a better understanding of what the questions are. And that's sort of what I would summarize to be sort of the big contribution of my work over the past 8 years. Now, I promise this isn't buy my book as a pitch, but if you are interested in reading more about this topic, there is a book on this coming out on the 15th of April, which is basically the solutions part of this. Complained a lot about the problems, and this is, you know, the cliffhanger ending. We'll find out the solutions there. But there's also a whole bunch of stuff that can't be part of this lecture here, that as in, it's not just tabletop accessibility that I've been looking at over the past few years. It's also how we teach ethics and professional issues. And along with Pauline Belford here, we have a second book you might be interested in, which is a case study for computer ethics in context. Now, that book is basically a series of case studies in which a university professor, naming no names, not a real person, don't worry, it's not you, is found out to have conducted some research that maybe wasn't 100% on the level. The local newspaper finds out about it, and then the rest of the case study is sort of the unraveling of what actually happened, who was involved in forcing the thing to happen, and what the outcome was. So that's the basic sort of final summary of this. If you are interested in reading more, I would normally direct you to a bunch of papers, but you know, there's these books, and these books combine things together. And with that, I think, unless there's any questions, that's me. Is it the color blindness question again?
Available for others to use it for generative interaction design or design?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Sarah unfortunately had to leave because she's got to do like a bunch of interviews. But Sarah and I have talked about this a fair bit as a general tool for people understanding interaction in particularly tactile environments. But I don't think it necessarily has to be tactile environments at all, as in that's where it's been tested most rigorously. But there's nothing to say just going over these things and sort of working out, well, what are the problem points that we can actually deal with? I've used this a number of times as a teaching tool, and what I basically do is I clear all the text off, and I give the blank grid to students and say, okay, think about what you're actually asking people to do. Where do you see there being potential problems? And then once you actually get the map of the potential problems, then it's a case of doing a triage, as in what's your high impact, easy to fix thing? What's your low impact, hard to fix thing? Ignore that. You're not going to be able to do that one at the time you have. But by getting this sort of empathy building exercise of just looking at things from the perspective of not somebody with disabilities who you can't necessarily 100% relate to, but you in everyday circumstances, I found it quite effective in getting people to think about this in a way that just saying, think about other users doesn't do. Not when planning courses. No, maybe it's worth doing. I don't know. I've never actually thought about using it for sort of that kind of academic kind of thing, but there's no reason why not. Because yeah, I mean, I probably shouldn't admit this in a room full of people who I work with. I don't spend that much time thinking about what I'm asking people to do in a course to map to see where the sort of accessibility issues would be. And as Hannah well knows, my approach to people who want compensation for particular disabilities and such is basically to say, you get to design your own assignment in all these courses, so just design something that works for you. But yeah, I definitely think this is a tool that could be useful for more kinds of things. It's just, I can only swear to it being useful in the domains that we've actually tested it with. So Yasmina, you had a question? Sorry? Chess. Yeah. I mean, it's tremendously accessible from some perspectives. But if, for example, let's say you were dealing with somebody who had an intellectual processing disorder, fluid intelligence disorder, or even a memory disorder, basically what you have there is, in order to play chess well, you have to not just react to things, you have to be sort of thinking several moves ahead. And for some people, that's not going to be possible to do, because thinking one move ahead and sort of interpreting that in the rules can be a difficult thing for people to do. So what tends to happen, I find, in most games is that in role-playing games, we sort of refer to this idea of a dump stat, which is there's a thing that defines your character that you don't care about for the character you are. You're a wizard, you don't care about how strong you are. You're a fighter, you don't care about how smart you are. And when I'm sort of talking to companies about how they might actually use this tool to make more accessible games, what I normally say is, consider if your game has one of these categories that you are not going to be able to excel in. You're not going to be able to make a version of Scrabble that works well for somebody who has a communication impairment. So if you need to have that dump stat already in there, maybe you move all your inaccessibilities into that category. If you can do a translation, translate it from something that needs maths into something that needs language, because that you're not going to win there anyway. And I would say for chess, you're probably talking about, in terms of the cognitive processing, is the dump stat of chess. And almost everything else can be. I mean, you can get incredibly cheap chess sets. You can get chess sets that are, specifically designed for people with visual impairments. You can get Braille chess sets and all these different kinds of things. Emotional, I don't know. People do invest a lot of cultural cachet in their ability to play chess. But again, bringing back the idea of Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer invented a variation that's called Fischer chess, which is you no longer need to spend your time memorizing opening positions and strategies, because you randomize the order of the pieces at the back. So it becomes a game about reacting to things, as opposed to a game of saying, well, aha, you used the Fibonacci opening, therefore I'm going to use the whatever, the haversack defense, or these different kinds of things. People complain about chess these days as being, you need to memorize a whole bunch of fixed openings and responses to them. And that sort of gets around the fact that you need to memorize these kind of things. Just make it reactive, make it fun. So yeah, there are ways of doing it, but certainly in a lot of categories, chess is a really good example, but in other categories, it's not. So does that stop with the questions?
Congratulations, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Very nice presentation.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It was very different from what I'm used to.
Oh.
That's why I liked it a lot.
Great.
Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now you know at least you have a diploma.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to try not to kill these as quickly as I normally kill anything. Yeah. Yeah, sorry? Yes. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody. I believe we have cake in the break room in Coogan. So, yeah, let's all go have some cake.